seems that when people learn about the pleasure trap, they understand why it's not their fault. And because they understand why it's not their fault, they get a better understanding of what they need to do in order to commit to this lifestyle. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, sure. The pleasure trap is this hidden force that undermines health and happiness. It's actually the reason why people are overweight, why they develop metabolic syndrome, why they're, as a consequence, developing coronary artery disease and diabetes and autoimmune diseases. It's really why people are fat, sick, and miserable. And this hidden force it's not so obvious to people because it involves the artificial stimulation of dopamine in our brain. And dopamine is this neurochemical associated with pleasure. So, we're designed to believe that if something feels good, it is good. And in a natural setting, that holds pretty well true. But in the modern world, we've changed the environment we live in such that we're vulnerable to these pleasure traps. An example of pleasure traps can be drugs. Drugs can make people feel good without actually being good. Another example are chemicals that we add to our food. And it's these chemicals that we add to our food that stimulate dopamine production in our brains. These chemicals added to the food, for example, of rats, result in the rats systematically overeating. If you put these chemicals in rat chow, the rats will gain 49% of their weight in 60 days. And it works in humans too. If you put these chemicals in our feed, or the food that people eat, we'll become progressively and predictably overweight. And the chemicals that I'm talking about are SOS. SOS, of course, is the international symbol of danger, but it also stands for salt, oil, and sugar, because it's the addition of salt, oil, and sugar to our food that's responsible for our obesity. Salt, oil, and sugar are not actually food, but they're highly concentrated food byproducts that are added to food to stimulate dopamine production and make food taste better. That's essentially what tasting better means, is it has a higher caloric density, more calories per unit. And so when we take food and then we add salt, oil, and sugar into it, it tastes better. It results in systematic overeating. And eventually that leads to obesity, which it contributes to metabolic syndrome, which is why, people are vulnerable from dying from everything from cancer and heart disease to COVID-19.
Yeah, and that's something that most of the